Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are hangingontohope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. So welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Karen W. Today we welcome one of our podcast favorites, Sheila Gregoire, and her daughter, Rebecca Lindenbach. They are two out of the three authors of their new book, She Deserves Better: Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up. So welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yes, it's great to have you guys.
Yeah, great to have both of you. This is awesome.
So let's begin with how this book builds upon your first book, which we interviewed you both on, The Great Sex Rescue. Why did you feel this book was necessary, especially in today's culture?
Well, okay, so for Great Sex Rescue, we were looking at what evangelical teachings have hurt women's marital and sexual satisfaction. Yeah, we had a great conversation with you, so people can go back in the archives and find that one. But we surveyed 20,000 women, and we found that, you know what? Sometimes the church is really hurting women, and let's figure out what God intended. And so many women said, okay, I feel so validated. I feel so seen. This is great. But now I have absolutely no idea what to say to my kids, because I grew up with toxic teachings. I don't want to perpetuate that, but I also don't want them just throwing caution to the wind and going out and having sex with everybody. So what do I do instead? And that's where this project came in. So we surveyed another 7,000 women. So this is based on a whole new study of their experiences in church as teens and what messages they also heard and how those things impact them long term, so that we can figure out what's really healthy and what's not.
Yeah, because we can't really rely on the church necessarily to give the best information.
Wow, that's great. I didn't know that you interviewed.
Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah, my kids are probably part of that. And they're struggling now as adults, especially what they went through.
Right, mine too.
Just that they were part of that purity culture and had to wear those rings, and I don't know. But they're really good kids, thank goodness.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a big struggle for them, I think.
Yeah, mine too, for sure.
So can you share the research that went into this book and what questions you were trying to answer?
Yeah, of course. So we did a follow-up survey like what we did for our first book, but this time we wanted to specifically ask again about the messages that girls heard in high school. So we looked at really popular books, and we looked at focus on the family resources to teenagers from, around the time of 2000 to 2008 or so. So when the people in our survey were likely to be, in high school. And we looked at messages about modesty, messages about consent. We looked at messages about your worth. But the big thing that we really wanted to also ask about, which we didn't ask about in our first survey, was their experiences in church. Were you exposed to sexual abuse in your congregation? Were you a victim of sexual harassment? Those kinds of questions as well. Were you exposed to an inappropriate relationship between a leader and someone else in the congregation? Those kinds of questions. And then we wanted to measure our marital and sexual satisfaction outcomes like we always do, because we want to make sure that we're actually setting our girls up for success. But we also wanted to talk about self-esteem. And that was a really big one on this one. On this survey, we wanted to talk about self-esteem, and we used really rigorous, really well-established self-esteem measure called the Rosenberg measure of self-esteem. And what that means is we could measure whether or not the church's teachings actually made girls have their self-esteem drop. Mm-hmm. And that has serious implications. We know that having higher self-esteem is related to pretty much everything you want for your kid, okay?
Yeah.
You have everything good, because self-esteem it's not actually the big boogeyman that we were taught about. In a lot of churches, we were said that, you don't need self-esteem, you need God-esteem, right? We hear that kind of stuff when we were in the middle of purity culture. And what self-esteem is really just about is understanding that I actually matter. It's not, I am the most important person and everyone should bow and kiss my feet and everyone should, just hang on my every word. That's not what it is at all. It's just saying I matter. My voice should have space. I deserve to take up space because I was put here for a purpose and I am a good, loved, lovable person who should be treated with dignity and respect. And I'm competent and I feel confident. So we wanted to measure self-esteem too, because if a girl doesn't get married, right, we wanted to make sure we still had lots of outcome variables that we could measure for her as well. Because in our Great Sex Rescue, we were obviously only looking at married women. But when you're looking at high school effects, you're not only looking at married women, you're also looking at the women who didn't get married. So we didn't want to leave them out.
Yeah, that's interesting because I thought that was fascinating, all the different studies and how you were able to kind of track that, because that is important. That's a big indicator of what kind of relationship you're going to get into if you don't have good self-esteem and if you, like you were saying. And I loved all because I had boys, so we got all the Focus on the Family magazines. We didn't get Brio.
What was it? Breakaway? Wasn't it Breakaway for boys?
I know. I was trying to think. I think so. They loved those. They read all of those. So I was having flashbacks when you were quoting from Brio, even though I didn't look at those. It was similar, just a similar type of talk. So being the mom of boys, I would have loved to have read this book when I was a youth. It doesn't have the same, I can't sit down and read it to my boys. They wouldn't be interested in it. But I just kept thinking about, wow, if my mom had this book, when she was younger, if I could have read this, it would have helped me a lot. And you say in the book that youth groups in general have a lot of landmines for girls' faith. Did you want to share more about that?
Yeah. So what people may not be aware of is that for the first time that we have ever measured it, if you look at the youngest adults, which is Gen Z adults, women are more likely to say that they don't believe in any religion at all than men are. And that's actually an earthquake. I don't think people get how important this is.
Yeah. And that wasn't our research. When we say when we measure, we mean like the research community. Like that was someone else's research.
And so, but this is huge. Okay. Because women have always been more religious than men across most cultures, across time. Women have been more religious, but for the very first time, men are more religious than women among the youngest adults. Why is that? It's because women are leaving the church faster than men are in these younger years. And when we looked at our research, we kind of figured out some reasons why, which is women are taught that they don't matter. Over and over again in our youth groups, in our church settings, women are taught, hey, you talk too much. You're more easily deceived. It's men who are supposed to be in charge. You take second place. You need to defer to the men around you. All of these teachings contribute to the idea that women have that, why should I go to church? I am treated better outside the church. And for a lot of our youngest women, that's true. And that is tragic.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Wow,
totally.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I do love that part you talk about self-esteem earlier on the last question. We just did a podcast with Bob Hamp and he talks about becoming independent. And one of the first steps is connecting with yourself and then connecting with God. And I realized as I'm going through this healing that connecting with yourself is self-esteem. And people look at it in a negative way, but you have to connect with yourself and feel that you're worth something, that you are important and that God has a plan for you.
Right.
It's not about thinking you're better than anyone else. It's about realizing that you are so loved and you are important.
Right. Because you may not have done that.
I think there's a misconception about self-esteem.
Yeah,
I really do.
Well, there absolutely is. One of the really big teachings that we talk about in our chapter about boundaries, I believe actually, is this idea of joy, Joy. And I don't know if you know where I'm going with this or not, but the acronym was Jesus first, others second, you third.
Yeah.
So let's actually think about this. If Jesus is first and then others are second and you're third, there's no one below you. Because everyone else is an other. That means that you always come last.
Yeah.
And when you look at the biblical reason that they say for this is this idea that we should, love your neighbor. And this is how you love your neighbor. When you actually look at the passages about loving your neighbor, it doesn't say love your neighbor and instead of loving yourself.
Right.
It says love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yes.
It's not that you're supposed to put yourself underneath of someone else. It's that we're supposed to elevate the importance of others in our minds to the level that we hold ourselves, because we all are naturally going to be a little bit more selfish in terms of our desires as human beings. There's lots of studies in that, right?
Right.
Like, and there are some people who are the opposite, of course, who have been traumatized or abused, a lot of them, who have learned that protecting themselves actually hurts them.
Yeah.
And so to tell, especially those people,
Right.
that you come third, like someone who's already experienced abuse, that you come last, and Jesus wants you to come last.
Yeah.
Jesus wants you to let everyone else do what they want first, including to you, because that's what little girls hear. We tell this to kids as young as 3, 4, 5 years old. There's songs for preschool, Sunday school classes about this. Those little bitty kids are being told you're last.
Yeah.
Not everyone's important. Not everyone is special. Not Jesus loves everyone. It's you're less important than others. And that's exactly what you're talking about with the self-esteem stuff. It's understanding that we actually get to see ourselves on the same playing field as everyone else, when so many of us have been taught systematically from when we were children, and especially women have been taught systematically that we are not, it's not good enough to see everyone as important as us. We need to actively put ourselves underneath of others, even if they seek to do us harm. We need to erase our own reality so that it becomes palatable to other people, instead of saying, no, I matter and you matter. So let's seek the truth in this. It's how do I make sure that you feel happy, even at my own expense? And it does not take a rocket scientist to see how that can go desperately, desperately wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Why this is how girls are taught that having boundaries is a bad thing.
Yes.
Because Jesus gave up everything for you. So why can't you give up everything for other people? And this is the message that often we hear in church, even if it's not completely explicit or said like that, that is often how we feel. I remember a time where you, Rebecca, they were doing the 30-hour famine.
No, it wasn't 30-hour famine. It wasn't that particular one, but I know where you're going. Yeah,
Okay.
we're doing one of those typical youth group of things where we're going to be at the church overnight and play silly games until 4 a.m.
For no explicable reason. I don't know why youth groups do these things. But there was a really creepy dude. He was 18. You were probably like 15.
I was 14.
Okay. He was 18 and he was really creepy, and he was known to have sexually assaulted.
Yeah, we had very good reason to believe that he was actually a dangerous man.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so you go to the youth leader and you say, hey, I am not comfortable. And the other girls are not comfortable with him here. And the youth leader's response was, you're just being judgmental and you think he's weird, but don't you realize he needs Jesus? And completely dismissed the girls' legitimate concerns about their safety. Now, interestingly, the boys in that youth group saw the problem, and the boys buddied up with all of the girls to make sure that no girl was ever alone, so that this guy couldn't get to them overnight.
We had such great guys in that youth group. Honestly, they were fantastic.
Yeah, but the youth leader dismissed it because, don't you know, he needs Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so your safety is unimportant compared to his need for Jesus. And so because he needs Jesus, he gets to come and pose a danger to the girls here.
Yeah, the girls end up being child sacrifices.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have a friend that her daughter was raped by a youth pastor. So, and we hear about that, all the time. So it's totally like what you're saying.
Yeah, we found an incidence rate of
within our survey.
Yeah, in our survey, 19% of girls said that they had been assaulted or abused by someone at church, and of those who had been, 10% were by a pastor.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you before I started the next question. Is you talked about how in this interview that you asked women if their experience in the church, if they were assaulted, or are you going to explain the results? What were the answers to that? I'm very curious.
Yeah, so it was about 19% had been abused. Of those, 13% overall were abused by an adult as a minor. So that's pretty big. That's like over 10% of girls were abused in church as a minor. And then when you break down that 19% who were abused, because some were assaulted or abused by a peer, and so that's why it's not the full 18.7%.
Hmm.
But you had like 10% of those were assaulted or abused by a pastor, 20% by another youth leader, and then I think it was like 48% by another adult, and then 52% by a peer. So those don't add up to 100 because people might have been assaulted and abused by multiple people.
It's just heartbreaking.
Wow. That is very heartbreaking. Well, we touched on this a little when we interviewed you for the Great Sex Rescue. Why have Christian resources not talked about consent well?
I would love to have a real answer to that one because it kind of makes me really mad. I think during purity culture, what happened was people were so focused on making sure that kids didn't have sex that it felt like the consent conversation wasn't necessary because all we need to tell kids is don't do it. So if we give the consent conversation, it's kind of like we're saying, but you might be doing it. And we're not going to go there.
Yeah, or even kind of seems like you're giving some permission in some situation. Because if you're giving the guidelines for how to have safe sex or consensual sex, then it's saying, well, are we really telling them they're allowed to?
But then what ends up happening is that in our resources, there are so many teachings that are directly against consent. Like, let me just give you an example. Shanti Feldon wrote a book called For Young Women Only, and I'm about to give you a statistic. I do not believe the statistic is accurate. I think that her survey question was written poorly. Her answers, the possible answers they could choose from were written poorly. And then the way that she grouped the answers was not accurate. So don't believe this stat. But what she said was that 82% of boys feel either little ability or little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. And then she really emphasized these words in a thought bubble. If you want to stop, it's safest to not even start. Now, 100% of boys have the ability to stop.
Right.
Because what's it called if you don't stop having sex that someone doesn't want to have? What's that called?
Rape.
It's called rape.
Yeah.
Like this isn't called, a little teenage mistake. No, it's rape.
And when we say boys can't stop, what we're saying is boys can't help but rape you.
Right.
And yet over and over again, we see this in every young woman's battle. Shannon Etheridge gives a story of a girl who she and her boyfriend decided that they were not going to go very far. And then as soon as they were alone, her boyfriend started pushing her anyway. And she got carried away and she let him do things to her, she says. And then Etheridge's comment is, she should have known better.
Wow.
Yeah, that's horrible. And I don't,
It is
I mean,
horrible.
And that's the problem, is that it portrayed boys' sex drives as being out of control. And so girls had to be the ones to be the gatekeepers. They had to be the ones to put on the brakes. And this was largely taught. Boys are the accelerators, girls are the brakes. So then if a guy goes too far, it's not actually his fault. The problem is she didn't put the brakes on properly.
right.
Well, and not only that, we did focus groups with rape survivors from high school as well. We had interviews with quite a few of them. And one of them talked about how the mentality that it's your job to stop it also then implies that if it happened, you must have let it happen, which means you must have consented.
Right.
So it's like, unless he physically has a gun to your head situation, if sex happens, it's your fault. The girl. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if he was threatening you. Doesn't matter if he wore down your resolve. Doesn't matter if he coerced you. Doesn't matter what. If it happened, it's therefore your fault because you would have stopped it and you knew and you should have known and you put yourself in the position that he would have to have sex with you. And so therefore you made it happen.
Right.
Yeah. If you
So
consented
wrong.
to kissing,
Yeah.
you started making out. What did you expect was going to happen?
Exactly.
That's all that shame on the girl.
Yeah, I think with abuse victims, it's part of that self-esteem as well, because if the person's in the church and they make you feel like I felt like I didn't matter. Like I had no say so and I didn't matter.
Yeah.
So yeah. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, we kind of touched on this already, but you say in your book that a lot of these teachings impact girls' self-esteem in high school and as young adults. And you ask, is self-esteem a good measure? Since in church, we're told to base our worth on Christ. And you kind of touched on that, I think, a little bit, but it's kind of like just that view that's given to them in the youth.
Yeah. And I think that self-esteem is often confused with thinking that I am the best or with
Mhm.
self-centeredness.
Right.
Actually, self-esteem is highly correlated with all kinds of good things, with better mental health, with better relationships, with better job prospects and doing better at your job. Like there are no downsides to good self-esteem.
Yeah, you're right.
And yet so often we make it sound like self-esteem is this terrible thing that we should not be promoting. And instead we need to realize that we are all wretched and there's nothing good in us. And that's really a distortion because we're all made in the image of God.
Yeah.
Right.
And we carry the Holy Spirit in us. Like we are important.
Yeah.
Jesus died for us. There is great worth in that. We are children of God.
Yeah, that should be what's emphasized.
I think people
Mhm.
think if they have self-esteem that they're not going to be humble, but that one has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the other.
Yeah. 'Cause
You're
it's
not thinking you're better than others
Right.
because you have self-esteem.
It's not looking.
But don't we all know people who take such great pride in being really humble? Like,
It's so funny. Exactly. It's like, well, I'm the most humble of them all. Call me Mr. Humble.
You know,
No one's been as humble as
like
me.
people with a martyr complex. Like, oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot as soon as you say that.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is just one of those things are exactly what you were saying is what often happens is you have these teenagers and teenagers just are little egocentric little beings. That's fine. That's a well-known concept in adolescent
Phase
psychology.
that you go through, kind of.
Egocentrism.
Yeah.
Right? So when we're talking to our daughters about how to become good people, how to grow into the adults that God wants them to be, to how to have the kind of life that we as their parents want them to have, because I had my little girl while we were writing this book. So we're thinking about this a lot. We can see that adolescent egocentrism. And I think that's where a lot of this focus on squashing the self-esteem comes into play, because we're like, well, we don't want them to focus on themselves too much. And what if instead we had taken that and seen it for what it is, which is God's gift to us, that our kids have this time in their lives. They're so doing all this introspection and they're thinking, what makes a good person? Am I a good person? What does everyone think about me? How can I become this kind of person? And we actually use that time to help them develop this healthy self-concept, healthy self-esteem.
Yeah.
And we focus on teaching them their worth in Christ instead of just squashing all that life out of them so they aren't a problem. Instead, what if we embraced that time of life that God made our kids to go through? So they can learn important life tools so that when they're 19 and they're dating the guy they really shouldn't marry, they know that they're allowed to stand up and say, I deserve better than this, because so many women were not told that.
Right. And the red
Many women
flags
were
don't.
told, you don't
go off
deserve
as
better
much.
than this.
Right. It turns them into like people pleasers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That sets them up for, thinking that those red flags are just pink flags,
Yeah.
They can
And I think that there's a lot of aspects of adolescence in terms of those big feelings we get and the big questions we get and the hissy fits and the talking back and the testing authority that is often seen as a bad, sinful, terrible thing. And what I'm hoping we can do with She Deserves Better is see how our daughters deserve to take up space. And these years are such a wonderful formative time to give them a voice, to encourage them to use that voice, and to help them find out how to use that voice appropriately and with strength and confidence and dignity, and to get them out of religious environments that would teach them that they should be small.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
that's how we can help our girls be safe. And that's how we can help them really run after Christ.
Yes. Right on. That's so right on.
Yeah. One of your outcome variables that you measured in your survey was the likelihood a girl would marry an abuser. So tell us, what red flags did you find?
Oh, there's all kinds of things that are highly correlated with that. First of all, self-esteem is the biggest, right? So you want to raise a child with high self-esteem. So you talk to them, you encourage the relationship, you encourage them to have their own thoughts, to let them express their opinions, even to disagree with you sometimes. Let them know that they matter. That's crucial for self-esteem. But there's a couple of other things that really play some interesting roles. Here's one that you might not think of. When a girl is embarrassed of her period, she is, I forget, it's like 70% more likely to marry an abuser.
I'm literally in the book looking for this stat right
yeah,
now.
I'm pretty sure it's 70%.
Wow.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And now it's not that being embarrassed of your period leads you to marry an abuser. Okay. There's a third thing that we think is going on there, which is if you're embarrassed of your period, you think there's something fundamentally wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a lot of shame about my body, about who I am. I think I'm gross. If you can't talk to your mom or your friends about your period, like it just means I think that I am bad at some level. And when you think that, you're very likely to marry a man who agrees with you.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because otherwise it's shocking as a teenager or when you get your period, it's kind of the shock of like, what's happening? And if it's not explained that, oh, this is a beautiful thing. I mean, it could be explained in a way that wouldn't cause shame.
It even
this is just, you know what? Every woman goes through this. There's going to be some weird things. Yeah, you might leak and stuff, but don't worry about it. Everyone understands. They're all going through it. Sometimes you're going to get crampy. You know, it's okay. Here's some other ones that are really highly correlated. The modesty messages. So when we believe that boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand and that boys can't help but lust if a girl is dressed like she's trying to incite it, those things make a woman 68% more likely to marry an abuser.
Wow.
So believing that boys can't help, let's think about this. If you believe that boys can't help but lust if a girl's dressed like she's trying to incite it, or if you believe messages like boys can't stop, so girls are responsible for stopping the make-out progression, what are you really saying about men? You're saying that male sexuality and the objectification of women are one and the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That a man cannot treat a woman well because all men are going to be looking at you primarily as a sexual object. So if you're lucky, he may also love you, but he's always going to primarily see you as a sexual object. Now, if that's what she believes about men, if she meets a guy who is treating her badly, who is checking out other women in public, who has a horrible porn use problem, is she going to realize this is not a good guy? Or is she going to think this is just how men are?
Right.
Yeah.
That they're all like that, that they have no self-control and that's just the way they are.
And like, why did the church teach this? Why does the church teach that all men struggle with lust? It's every man's battle. Well, I think it's because it's mostly men in the leadership in our churches. It's mostly men writing these books. And when they teach that, well, then men don't really have to fix themselves because this is just how guys are.
Well, and then it's all the men that have read those books, like our ex-husbands, that agree with it.
Yeah.
And then tell their wives
it reinforces that.
It reinforces
belief.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It totally does.
Exactly.
And it doesn't help the wife that's in that situation.
Not at all.
So I listened to the podcast you did with Preston Sprinkle on the Theology and the Raw podcast, where you guys did a great job, I thought, of pushing back when he was talking about what he says to his daughters about modesty and boys' sex drive, kind of what we were talking about. I thought it was very well done podcast. I love that I thought you guys just did a great job.
So you like Rebecca's anti-rape raccoon?
Yes. Yes, that was a good analogy.
So, yeah, our Patreons are going nuts for that, I will say.
You'll have to listen to it to know what we're speaking about. Little inside joke.
Yeah, no, that was good. Did you want to share any about that podcast? Did you guys get a lot of feedback on that?
Yeah, we have. I think what I find so encouraging about the podcast is that there are so many people who responded saying, thank you, because Preston was saying things that the men in my life say all the time. And I have never known how to counteract those arguments. Arguments such as the ones he was making were things like boys have a really high sex drive, so it's just harder for them to stop during sex. So girls need to understand that so that they're warned. And we were saying, well, no, wait a second. First of all, whether or not boys have a higher sex drive, it's not harder for them to stop during sex. We always have a choice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? To rape is always a choice. It's not a choice that is mitigated by how difficult it is to stop. Right. It's always a choice. And also a lot of that, lack of willingness to stop likely comes more from our culture of male sexual entitlement than it does biology.
Yeah,
but anyway,
kind of explaining.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that a lot of people have just been really encouraged to know, hey, here are the arguments that we can say when people are saying things like, but if she wears clothes that are too revealing, she's going to get looked at and she's going to have men lust after her. And so she needs to make sure to cover up, or, but girls just need to understand how boys are. Those kinds of talking points. I think it's been really encouraging for a lot of people to feel like they actually have the words now. So we can speak about what we said, but I do encourage people to actually listen to the whole podcast because it's
I thought it was
a long one. It's like an hour and a half on and of itself. So
It is. And I thought it was interesting that I don't think it was the very next guest that he had, but then shortly after that, he had what was the gal's name that you were talking about?
Shanti Feldon?
Yeah. He had her
Yeah.
on. And I'd read some comments because I follow him on Instagram on that podcast on Instagram. And most of the comments were not real supportive of that I read anyway. And I thought it was interesting.
Because her whole point was that we shouldn't be calling out people publicly, authors publicly who have done harm. We should be going to them privately. And of course, that is not the biblical example. The biblical example is when teaching is done in public, it is corrected in public.
Mm-hmm.
And when an author who has done harm is on a podcast arguing that other people should not have the right to speak up in public, when she herself is on a large podcast, what she's really saying is only I get to shape the narrative. And that's simply not right.
Especially when we're talking about 14, 15-year-olds who were raped.
And I listened to it because I wanted to, I didn't listen to the whole thing. I actually stopped listening to it at one point, but I was curious, if I thought, well, maybe she's really going to come across of like, yeah, I was wrong on a lot of things, but instead I didn't hear that. I heard more like what you were saying. So I kind of stopped listening after a while.
Yeah. Well, without, mentioning any authors' names or any books, I'm talking about in general, the men and the people that have been abused like us and their ex-husbands, that wherever they got this idea from, which is probably these books.
Yeah, it certainly is.
They are teaching my boys, and they're teaching them that it's okay. This is just how you are as a man. And they had to hear that from somewhere. And it's wrong. So now my boys actually believe things that are wrong. Like, that's just the way men are, but they're turning into great young men and they're starting to realize that this isn't true on their own.
Yeah.
But somebody's feeding that. And that's wrong.
Right. That's why we need to talk about it.
That's just wrong in general.
Right. It is.
And our girls deserve better and our boys deserve better too, frankly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is just so frustrating. For me, it is. Because I'm seeing it. Karen has 3 adult boys and I have 2 and then a daughter in the middle. And just what they're all going through because of all this. Because I'd say in the last 30 years, that's when men started to get I'm dominant in the church and you have to do what I say.
The whole thing. Well, definitely the homeschool community emphasizes that. I
don't know if it was like that before that, but they're hearing it from somewhere. So if a pastor read those books and then told my ex who was a pastor and then he told my boy, it gets passed down. So this is so damaging.
Yeah. That's why it's important.
It's so damaging. I'm not going to even mention names. It's just damaging. So, okay, let's go to the next question. Any more that you want to say about the clothing modesty rules for girls and women?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about modesty. So the problem with modesty. Sorry, I'm just, you can't visually see, but I just leaned back in my chair and crossed my legs. So this is my thing.
Here we go.
So, modesty has been made so synonymous with making sure boys don't lust after you and sexual attraction that it's lost all meaning in terms of healthy conversation. Because here's the thing.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of She Deserves Better. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.